Okay, welcome. Sunil, if I can ask you to join me here on the screen on our virtual stage. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sunil. Thank you so much for your keynote presentation, which touched upon many different layers and enriched even after those 10 days of conference, yet gave us another direction that we haven't really touched on that much so far. Thank you for that. I want to dive in directly and ask you to help me a little further in discerning the problems, the ideas that you deliver to us. You start out with a quote, or not start out, but in the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned a quote by Adrian Rich, which I loved, and I haven't heard it before. Theory in these times. How can we do theory? How do we make theory that rises from the earth and at the same time gives back to the earth? And I think that's very much at the center of what we're maybe also trying to achieve here in this conference, think about here in this conference. And at the same time, you ask, so how can psychology help us understand this crisis? And then from there, when I relive your talk, it's kind of an explosion of problems. When we think about psychology, psychology has on the surface so many answers, drawing on studies that have been conducted, numbers, etc., hypotheses that have been proven, disproven. But then also there's critical psychology with certain answers. Then there's a historiosity to psychology. And you slowly undermine this, if I may say so, in your talk by showing how psychology, even in many ways also critical psychology, in the past has failed to, and only is now starting to reflect a colonial heritage. And what I want you to do with what I'm asking you with my first question here is to say, so can you try again to kind of discern this conundrum for me? How can we shape psychology now that we are in a crisis? Or maybe phrase it differently, what can we as psychologists do now in this crisis, given the baggage that you have shown us?
Okay, so I'm trying to recall some of the fragments of your questions. So I just made some notes while you were asking me those questions. At least I have sort of three themes that you asked me to touch on. So I'm going to quickly say a little bit about each one of those. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I think the first one was Adrian Rich's excerpt on, what is the role of theory? And here I think it's sort of not me alone, but for the last 20, 30 years, one perpetual element or theme in psychology as a discipline is that we've always been in crisis. I mean, if you go back 100 years, there's been some crisis. It's like perpetual crisis. I mean, now it's time to kind of lay bare what that crisis means rather than just reflecting and speaking on and just describing, identifying its crisis, but its crisis really as a political, cultural project. I want to name what that means. And whose crisis are we speaking about? And there's a wide gulf between that. Unless and until we are really seriously attempting to find out, whose lives are at risk, whose lives have merited inquiry, it's very hard to get to the question of crisis. So it doesn't necessarily mean there are no social inequalities in other countries apart from Asia and Africa. There are, but unless we know its interconnected histories of the past, including colonialism, where we are today. And so I think that would be one way to think about the role of the theory, is to resurrect, excavate, and move away from a cultural amnesia and bring to fold that very deep, rich history into our understanding of our theories of self, or identity, or subjectivity. And that's sort of one, and the second piece of it is to what are we doing this theory for? I mean, I'm part of conceptual, theoretical, philosophical psychology for over 25 years. I think it can be used in very meaningful, fruitful ways to think about what is our, what Kenneth Gergen speaks about, what is our relational imperative here when we use theory? What is our ethical imperative here when we use theory? So it's not necessarily to say that we need to not theorize, but in theorize in relation to the pandemic, then you have to really ask yourself this question about all the different crises that this pandemic has thrown. How do we then attend to the pre-pandemic issues that were there? They were magnified in ways that always existed for some people. So it's like, true, the pandemic is a shock, but for some it's been 100-year shock or a 75-year shock. It's a shock upon a shock. And where were we before that? Where was the sense of urgency? Where is the fierce urgency of now that, Dr. Luther King said? So sometimes when we see psychologists speaking, it seems to me that the fierce urgency of the moment is right at this. So this is not to dismiss or undermine the power of the pandemic, but to sort of try to make connections to other pandemics of different kinds, whether it's the pandemic of racism, pandemic of colonialism, and to come to grips with that in very practical, meaningful ways, and then connect it to this moment as well. I think that story is missing in our history, psychology specifically.
Yeah, and maybe even beyond psychology. I mean, if we think about the history of the pandemic, the typical the typical kind of reflex that we have at the moment is to say, "Oh, the Spanish flu," and we compare it to something that has happened in the past and took place in the global north or the Western world, and forget maybe about what is going on right now in other parts of the world. And you bring up other parts. Sorry, go ahead.
And just to add to that, because you brought up global north, global south, and part of doing decolonizing psychology is to sort of show kind of the post-imperial, post-colonial world we are living with. The instruments of coloniality are very much present, whether you want to look at it through an IMF lens, through fiscal policies, every domain that you can think about, culture, political, economic sphere. So unless we can connect power and knowledge in very meaningful ways, it would be hard to get a sense of how this pandemic is unfolding, in somewhat marginalized communities abroad, but whereas also here, they're connected. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something, to me, those instruments are psychological instruments, they're policy instruments. And that's where we need also deeper analysis before we can kind of unite theory with action.
I want to move to the one example that you bring up. You said while you prepared that talk, the story of Rampuka Pandit came up on the web. And maybe as a kind of flashlight of what is going on in a different part of the world. At the same time, the story and the way in which goes viral is embedded in a particular understanding, again, of the global South, I'd say, and of poverty and of the needs. And we look at it from the perspective of the global North. So it touches upon, well, the kind of emotionality that we feel, oh, there is something out there and people who are even worse off than we are. But it at the same time fits in a very common narrative. We can maybe box it easily and put it away. How can we use such examples, or how can we describe the empirical world on the ground so that we exactly avoid that, so that people don't listen to it as something that is in a far distant land where, yes, people are poor, but there's nothing they can do about in their local position?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think my intent to use Rampukar's story and like him was to sort of say that this is another lens through which we could see a crisis unfolding, and not to essentially pathologize the suffering there, but to really see how policies that we have put in place, either through that government or through the so-called G7 industries here in the global north, has such a ripple effect on people's lives there, whether it's for bread, whether it's for justice, whether it's for housing. And so it's not that the pandemic suddenly, upturned their lives. For me, the part, in some of my research, I've been arguing that this has been going on for a long time. And those are the stories we sometimes tend to latch on as a way of, showing. In the end, I spoke about the difference between feeling for and feeling with. And sometimes when these viral images go, we feel for a moment, we feel with. But there isn't really a solidarity as such, because we sort of step back and to really think about ways in which, if you have to address those people, people who live those lives are here in the United States too. Those lives are in Europe as well. To me, the point was to show a transnational connection between precarity of lives. And that's why I focused on Annie Grant as well, as a way to speak about. But unless we really, when we think about social suffering, sometimes our tropes are either pity or forgetfulness or indifference. But so we have to move away from those and kind of really think about our own complicity as well. And that's why you would not know our complicity, our field's complicity, unless we keep history in mind. And so that's why part of doing the decolonizing work is to come back to that again and again. So people like Annie Grant or Ram Pukar have always existed, but and their lives somehow seem very invisible to us. So those bodies have always been precarious and been attached to the psychological, physical, from a wellness point of view as well. But our urgencies, our questions are somehow missing, before the pandemic, in ways that I would say makes their lives more invisible. So the example for me is not so much to sort of say, oh yeah, that's happening there too, but really to kind of think about how is that happening there connected to what's happening to me here. The here and there are connected as well.
In many ways, you're touching upon not just a blind spot that is a product of a certain globalization, but a blind spot that has been with us in the way in which we have created, the Western maybe here, throughout the history, psychology, the way in which we have created a discipline.
I mean, you cannot divorce it from certain economic models and practices that have been put in place, whether through colonialism, post-colonialism, or neoliberalism, and through asymmetries of globalization. We have tended to leave our explanations of culture rather divorced from economic models for a long time, because they will let that, behavioral scientists or economic, theorists decide what that means, but they're very intertwined. And somehow psychology of livelihood, or psychology of what I would call a livelihood, which is essential for living. So the UN has all these different indicators of well-being. We have tended to individualize it as a matter of cognition, as a matter of mental phenomenon, and rather than really connecting it to even social practices. And that's still a very strong model. And unless we really find ways, that's why I wanted to give an example of what willful policy failure means. But willful policy means then really examining how it's not willful, is not like, Ibram Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is very clear that there is no such thing as an in-between position. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. He makes it very clear. He just spent a whole 200-page book it's the same thing, that, you can't take an in-between position. Either your policies do that or it doesn't do that. So it's time for us to be very clear, to name it and sort of think about it more collectively. If we are concerned about, the crises and other directedness and the ethical imperative that underlies it.
Let me connect that to a question that Izumi Sakamoto is bringing up here. Thank you for a great presentation, first of all. It just fills in a gaping hole we have in psychology, and I agree. I studied social psychology and cultural psychology in Michigan in the 1990s, having just come from Japan around the same time as you did. I went away from psychology and learned decolonizing methodologies in social work in Canada. How can we decolonize psychological training that's based on a dualistic, rational, enlightenment thinking for the most part?
I think that's a project of critical psychology and decolonizing psychology in very specific ways to, curriculum is a very important tool. That was the important tool during colonial times too. The reason I speak English is because it was through the curriculum that was offered up. A consciousness of self, linguistic consciousness is very strong. And so to me, one way to think about curriculum is to really, first again, kind of uncover a history, sort of what books we read, whose authors we read, what's been in the canon, what questions come up. And I think going back to the so-called culture wars of the 1990s has taught us something about how we need to redo the curriculum. And part of the redoing of the curriculum really means to kind of think through questions of history, but also questions of the present moment and selectivity. And whose questions are being put forth here, So after the pandemic, what kinds of questions are being put forth for what we consider psychological study? And for whom is it going to benefit? And to me, curriculum is a repository of knowledge, and that's the knowledge and power matrix. And that could mean a very simple thing when we do introduction to psychology. What psychologies do we refer to starting out? So right now, much of our curriculum is sort of very Eurocentric in the sense that we do a litany of theories, of ideas and history, and then we have this, kind of a very add model, kind of a add and stir model. The pot remains the same, the core ideas remain the same, and then we just add a few things here and there. But it doesn't really change the core structure, program, vision of ideas. So we hold on to what's essential, what's core, what's visible, and only add those external ideas or ideas in other geographies or places that we consider critical as a way of adding on to our curriculum, as a way of maybe just speaking about it in very token ways. It's like the way we do our kind of tourist approach to sometimes going to a foreign place, and rather than thinking through much more a solidarity, interconnection. And that's why I spoke about sociology of absences. Sociology of absences is the psychology of absences. And that requires, again, making connections to interconnected histories here too. And requires an active effort on our part, and that's been written about, to decolonize the minds. The reason why I like Fanon's work is because there is a strong emphasis on conditions that need to be put in place through learning, which leads to the decolonization of the mind too. Something that we are speaking about today in the United States, where we name whiteness and we talk about how do we confront whiteness or white privilege or white rage or white supremacy. But how first we need to name, recognize, and then think more, in deeper ways about its undoing. So part of that undoing to me happens through curriculum. And curriculum is very powerful, because that's how we all get socialized into a discipline.
Absolutely. Xiomara, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, connects to that and says, in attempting to undo the coloniality of psychology, I'm thinking that we have to literally throw some of the Western psychological practices out the door and replace them with locally accepted concepts to make psychology more meaningful to the local community that I, as a psychologist, serve. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that we have to localize psychology also? and give up on the idea of global theories, maybe?
I mean, one way to think about this is to sort of say that Western psychology has always been a local position. It comes out of a certain province. It's a local position that becomes dominant. And the way it becomes dominant is precisely what I try to show through coloniality. It has mechanisms by it. So one question to ask is, there have been all these local positions on practices of self and identity and culture and meaning making going on in different parts of the world. What is it that about the mechanisms of the West or Eurocentric conceptions that have gained dominance and become global? And when we think of the global local, we usually attach it to places like, Africa and Asia. They are local, they are pure, they're romantic, they're indigenous, and so on. So I think we need to also be careful while paying respect to the local, but understanding what is the kind of connection between the local and the global, how it constitutes each other now in this moment specifically. And second, to kind of ask ourselves also that sometimes while the local is pure, it's important, not pure, that the local offers up some interesting explanations, there are also contested claims about what is local within the local. So it can be very dangerous sometimes to make appeals to local by appealing to certain kinds of histories, which can also lead to certain fundamentalisms as well. So to me, a local offers one, definitely, a psychology, but there too, it's not necessarily an easy solution to what constitutes the local. And I can give many examples in which the local in particular ways has been used for subjugating communities, because that's the particular local that you have, whether it's religious history, whether it's a particular heritage about ideas. So there is that piece too, that is, whose local are we really thinking about in the same way, So I've been struggling to think about that too, but those are, I think, places, especially if you're bringing economic models back in here and we're thinking about well-being and livelihood, it might be better for us to think more transnationally, more transculturally, so this local global becomes much more intersectional rather than as these sort of separate entities.
Mm-hmm. Nandita is pressing the issue here a little bit, and I think you already spoke to her longer question, but I think the point that she's bringing up is very interesting. She is, first of all, thanking you for your powerful talk, and then she says, I'm beginning to feel that each time we use the expression decolonizing, we keep the idea of colonization alive. Isn't it a bit like hate? When you hate someone, you invest emotionally, and someone who you should probably purge from your psyche. Should we now change our strategy? And in many ways, you have just done that in what you said. But should we change our strategy with this significant pause in our lives around the globe? Everyone is calling for renewal and revision. Do you think there is a way forward where we can imagine a psychology as a science without using this expression decolonization in a post-colonial, this is not a spelling error, world, without losing the focus on plurality and international relations? Maybe we'll keep it at that and then it continues a little bit, but maybe you can speak to that first.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I like the idea. Hi, Nandita. I really like that question, and I've been thinking about that too. At what point do we stop talking about decolonization? In the same way, we cannot talk about post-racial America yet, as you could see from the last 3 days of burnings and protests and the killing of George Floyd and the issues of Black suffering and presence of racism that is brought on in post. I mean, one way for me to answer that question is there was the same question asked that once Obama was elected, that are we living in a post-racial world? Is racism of the past? So to me, even though the coronavirus or the post-coronavirus has brought out certain vulnerabilities across the world, and there have been moments of solidarity, I don't think we can get there yet unless fully we understand the psychology, again, as I said, of asymmetric suffering. So coloniality and decolonization is a way, as a framework, for us to really think about what principles of equality and justice can we use. If we reach at that point where we witness and where we say, yes, there has been some measure of equality and some measure of justice. So to me, what I see, decoloniality and decolonizing frameworks are much stronger and operable and relevant because our societies are becoming much more asymmetrical. And that's why I spoke about the racial contract. So the political and financial elites, at the moment they found out who, especially in the United States, which bodies are attached to the crisis, suddenly changed their narrative about the crisis and their sense of urgency. And so to me, there is coloniality in that. And so unless we really, to kind of answer Nandita's question is, I think it's something that it's hard for me to answer that question alone. It's a kind of solidarity question, because while decolonizing may not work for me because my needs have been met or because I'm in a position that's socially advantageous, but there are several others for whom there is a reminder daily that they live in a framework or a world of everyday practices where the devastation and the tragedies of living in a post-colonial, colonial world, whether you call it neoliberal world, is still very present. And so that's why I feel we need to continue to keep this framework alive, not just in terms of as a field, because I said decolonization comes from different fields in my book. It comes from indigenous and native studies. For them, it's very clear what they're looking for there. In the post-colonial thesis, it's a very different word of decolonization. Started in the 1950s, it meant nation states. And in the decolonial theory, it also has a different theory, a different ring to it. Each has different agendas. So I wouldn't say that so I have to be careful here that each of those, so first of all, we need to have some clarity on what we mean by that term, because it comes out of different frameworks. And so that, and each of them have different agendas. One has more practice agenda, where it's about reclamation of land. It's about the reclamation of histories, reclamation. In other places, there's a reclamation or recreation of the field. In other places, it's a different, but there's a family resemblance in all of these. And that family resemblance has to do with essentially questions of equality and ethics and, living. So I'll just pause there if she has a follow-up question. But
I'm sure she has and is also here, but I want to because we're unfortunately already slowly running out of time. I want to move on to Kezi Mahendran, who is asking you going in a similar direction and saying, you speak a lot about culture and coloniality, but you speak little, and I think you're actually not mentioning that in your presentation, but you've talked about it just now when you answered the question. You speak little about intersectionality. And her question is simply, is there a reason why you don't make more use of this body of literature on intersectionality?
Yes, I mean, for me, the getting at the transnational part, there's an intersectionality literature that is really important in understanding, the intersections across race, class, and gender and sexuality. But, and I think that's a very viable part of the decolonizing framework. I wouldn't say, just that I've not had the time to fully articulate that in the presentation. But to me, the intersectional intersectional framework and analysis is very solid, and it's part of it. The only reason why I didn't add to it is because there has become recently a way of just using that as a phrase and then flattening it out. And there's much literature and many scholars who have pointed out, and I'm not suggesting that the author is, I mean, the person who's asking the question is suggesting that. And so it requires its own, I would say, longer presentation, but intersectionality, if it points to a connection between lived experiences of suffering across these different social categories, but then they're always embedded within the cultural colonial framework. But those intersections, I would say, have different social categories and meaning in the United States and as opposed to, say, in Europe, as opposed to India. For example, if you think about intersectionality in India, then you would, of course, have to use caste categories. You know, those questions of caste become really much more important in thinking about explanations of how intersections of caste and race or caste and class, for example. So in my book, I do have a chapter in which I do kind of do a much deeper analysis of that as well. So to me, intersectionality is a powerful tool for us, but it can also be misused in flattening people's experiences without fully going into complex analysis of Rich about what these intersections mean and how they're connected to our material worlds.
We have many more questions here, and we'll take them all over to Slack. And I take the liberty as the moderator here to ask a question that is not on the list, or at least ask you to speak again a little bit more about the final part of your presentation, where you talked about radical care. Maybe you can spell a little bit more out for us again how we can use this concept in the current situation, what it can mean for us as psychologists to move forward politically.
I mean, part of radical care is to really ask ourselves, you know, the question of meaning making, narrative meaning making. You know, narrative here is a very powerful tool to think about radical care. That is going back to, first of all, what our theory serves. Because if this crisis is showing in a pandemic is the mirror that it shows is these devastating social inequalities as one of them, personal, social, existential suffering, then we have to ask ourselves this question about how do we use theory to really think about I went back to what is our connection, what is our conception to the community that we're living in? You know, the article from which I write is three parts to it. There is the affective dimension, it's visceral care, it's solidarity, it's not necessarily charity. It's the same question you ask, you know, in this time, sometimes we are safeguarded, we are at home because our lives are not threatened. It's easy to write about care from an abstract sense. Because our bodies are not attached to that immediate crisis. I'm asking us as those who do the work of psychology and those who are rethinking psychology in more political, social terms and critical terms, is to then think about what are those places which, you know, are in need of care, first of all. Do we know that? Can we identify that? And so part of that radical piece of solidarity really is to theorize in a way that works with those people. It's not that we are speaking about them. And that to me is another issue with psychology, that radical care in the past, even when we have not mentioned that sentence, it's always been research on people who are suffering, research on people who are marginalized. It's a very different take, you know, as opposed to, especially when Michelle Fine speaks about, you know, researching with, and this feeling with that I'm trying to articulate, that has a very different ring. A feeling with means you're understanding, you're not speaking on their behalf. You understand, you may not be in the same boat, you may not be in the same situation, but there is a different sense of experience you have. So it's also a different way of thinking about otherness too. And that, I think, is part of our kind of project of radical care. And I can kind of go on and say much more about it as well. But it really, at a very fundamental level, we have to think about reconceptualizing what community means, you know, in our local ways. There are circuits of dispossession where we live. There is more. There are societies around us. There are places of geographies around us that are dispossessed, whether it's schools, where there is real estate, where there's much more suffering because of the history that I pointed out to. But one part of radical care might be to think about how are our possessions, are our circuits of way we live are enlarged, expanded, become better as a result of the dispossession that is just a few miles from us. And that requires a much more solidarity, intersectional lens of thinking about places and people too. Because there you're asking a very different question, not so much how do I go out and help others, but the question kind of you flip is, how is that I got to the place that I got to, and what structures have been put in place that have allowed this kind of what I said, social mobility and so on, without invoking issues of merit as such, and so on.
Thank you so much, Sunil. As a Western male person who understands himself as a critical psychologist, I can only give out the message to everyone out there who hasn't managed to go to the store and buy your book and read it or get it out of the library, that they should do it, because that is what you just said is exactly what I took away from there. How is it that I ended up where I am, and how do I move forward from here? And yeah, so thank you for this wonderful discussion. I'm looking forward. Michelle Fine is actually coming up in a moment, and
Yes.
we will also see you tomorrow again at our final discussion.
Okay, thank you to all. Thank you to all the participants. I wish I could give more time and say more answers to each one of you, but thank you very much, and I was very very grateful and honored that I was invited to be a part of this very important discussion.
The honor is ours. Thank you, Sunil. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.